Hi, today I'm going to be talking about the Soviet command economy, which occurred throughout a 60-year period from around 1920 to 1980. While the organization of the economy changed throughout these years, the overall structure for state ownership, national economic planning, and the collectivization of agriculture was consistent. Throughout this era, the Soviet mechanism for resource allocation was the administrative command economy. Just a quick brief history of what happened before this time. The command economy followed the Bolshevik Revolution, which was a sharp change from the Tsarist era. The last 3 decades of the Tsarist showed growth, except it was still relatively low after the revolution was done. Then Joseph Stalin emerged and he brought upon 3 changes. We had a comprehensive system of central planning that was based on party directives, which actually ended the prevailing system of market relations. The agriculture was collectivized into a vast network of farms called kolkhozs, and there was a totalitarian system of government put in place which set up the Communist Party and its leaders to take control. During the beginning of this time period, V.I. Lenin conducted war communism and new economic policy. These were attempts to consolidate power as material incentives were created to incentivize labor, and it gave a preview of lessons that they should have kept in mind for the future. Now moving on to the framework for actually the Soviet economy. We know that from the text that all systems are made up of decision-making levels, market and plan mechanisms of information, property rights, incentive systems, and political governance. So in looking specifically at the Soviet economy, the decision-making levels was a vertical hierarchy where the Soviet state and the Communist Party share the authority and responsibilities. There were several decision-making layers from the state up top all the way down to the basic production units like the farm at the bottom. The mechanisms of information was a highly centralized system. The state made the decision on things like production, and distribution, and allocation for the short and long run. The property rights were that the state owned the property. There were no capital or land markets and no formal system of rewards, and the income generated from their use went directly to the state. For incentives, we had material incentives. However, they also highly emphasized moral incentives, which is a distinguishing characteristic of social systems. Finally, the political governance. The Communist Party was given what was the system for decision-making, control, and supervision. They also had an elected government, and the operational decisions were made through Gosplan, which is the state's planning agency. Now on to planning in theory rather than the actual practice. The enterprise and farm activities were organized by the ministries, and the hierarchy was based off of production. It was steel, agriculture, and machinery, and steel was the most important. The material balance system is important because this is the essence of all Soviet planning. It's the interaction between the CPSU, Gosplan, and the ministries, with the general directives come from the CPSU, control figures from the Gosplan, and an informational input directly from the ministries. These were known as Tech Prom Fin plans. The struggle with planning, though, was that they could only get to modify the plan each year rather than create a new one, since it was quite time-consuming and difficult. This was known as planning from the achieved level, and it was more focused on consistency rather than finding the optimal plan. Now planning in reality, when it comes to this, there were lots of deviations from the original planned economy. They were so strong that Eugene Zalesky suggested that it was barely a planned economy at all. The resource managers had such an impossible task, so the material balance ended up so grossly unbalanced. Even Joseph Stalin himself said these resources were being controlled mainly by the resource managers. The enterprises and ministries protected themselves by sometimes providing false information or preparing different plans for external and internal use. The unplanned exchanges that occurred were known as quasi-markets, and it was hard to find a balance between these informal and formal forces working together. Something that arose was the principal agent problem. Basically, these managers were required by the law of the land to fulfill their plan. They were awarded things by achieving certain outcomes, such as the gross value of output, which was one of the most important ones. They got things like housing and vacation and cars, which meant they were not caring much about the small items that brought little contribution, as they really just wanted the benefits rather than to try and maximize societal gain. There was this information asymmetry between the managers and Gosplan, since the managers are really the only ones that knew the true capacity for production. And the soft budget constraint was bad since they got subsidies if they couldn't cover costs. This meant profitability wasn't that important for them. Basically, the agents weren't doing what they were told because they couldn't really be punished. Most managers were breaking plan law, so any investigation would show every one of them doing something wrong. This is just interesting to note because this was one of the largest totalitarian regimes in history, and they could not effectively control its managers. They attempted rubile control, which was trying to track all the specific financial interactions and trace them, but that did not work either. Onto prices and money. The goal of this economy was money to barely have any significance. If things were rationed off, prices would have little importance, which is quite different than that of a market economy. These prices were set by administrative authorities. Basically, the wholesale prices were used in the accounting role, except when products were sold at the retail level, things changed. They could not be sold at wholesale level since they would be too high of a demand, so they had to add turnover tax. In this planned market system, this is considered a tax, yet in capitalism, this situation would suggest the supply should probably be expanded and new producers should enter the market. But basically, the mix of goods is determined by the preferences of the planners rather than the consumer demand. Another thing to note is that the necessities were priced low, while luxuries like automobiles and vodka were priced high. Moving on to the input prices of the economy. There is no formal system for the evaluation of land, and basically the price for labor was the wage rate, which was used to allocate the labor. The state would set wage differentials in an attempt to induce appropriate supplies to meet the demands they planned. There was also non-monetary rewards like press adulation or social benefits that were used to increase the labor supply as well. Basically, these policies were extremely successful at making the participation rate of the labor force extremely high. However, there were shortages in some areas and a lot of surplus in other areas. This was full employment resulting in overemployment, since it's pretty hard to lay off workers. This is a problem that occurred from guaranteed employment. Next, we have the financial planning done to ensure balance. While the overall goal is achieving macroeconomic balance, we're going to look at the specifics of this economy. The state would raise the wages to increase the labor, while simultaneously the prices of consumer goods would rise, however, not fast enough to absorb the full increase in demand that happened due to the higher wages. This is called repressed inflation. However, shortages were still occurring post-World War II, even though the quantity of goods increased, which means they must not have been reducing the excess demand enough. Basically, too much purchasing power is what ended up plaguing the Soviet Union in its final years. And there's this disequilibrium analysis that can be used to study a system like this that basically has excess demand that isn't resulting in a price increase. Next, we have capital allocation. Obviously here, the majority is owned by the state. As we say, there's always less capital available than demanded. But for here, the income generated by the capital goes directly to the state. Basically, the control of the wages and the control of the prices causes the savings rate to go high, which promotes capital accumulation. Except in the 1960s, we saw them begin to charge interest for using capital. There's actually a good formula used for weighing the trade-off between two capitals, and it's called the coefficient of relative effectiveness. This is helping us choose between two different projects. But something important to remember is that the overall capital allocation is still actually done through the administrative plan. So this formula is only used when selecting amongst projects that follow the original plan in the first place. Next, we have the market forces. They're pretty secondary in a planned economy, obviously. Other than the labor allocation and a few other areas, they're pretty much of little importance. However, the second economy is worth noting. This involves all things outside of the range of state control, and the criteria for it is that you must be engaged in private gain, and the person must be knowingly contravening the existing law. While it's difficult to scope the magnitude of the second economy, some studies say up to 20 to 25% of the transactions were illegal. And there are actually some positives to this, such as helping preserve incentives for the people and reducing some of the inflationary pressures. Next, we're going to move on to the agriculture. The agriculture is very different in a planned economy than in a market economy, as it is made up of 20 to 25% of the Soviet GDP. The different forms of organizing the agriculture include collective farms called kolkhozs, which operated like cooperatives with elected management and initially received dividends instead of wages. Then there were state farms called sovkhozs that had farmers paid like industrial workers in the state enterprise, and the state enterprise had state-appointed management. The peasant payments were done with labor days, which meant you would complete a task and be assigned a labor day. At the end of the year, Labor Day values were calculated by comparing the total amount of labor days with income. This was replaced in 1966 with guaranteed wage. Some of the changes that happened over time included the kolkhoz importance decreasing while the sovkhoz importance increasing. In 1940, it was 78% kolkhoz, and by the mid-1980s, it was 44% kolkhoz. Also, machine tractor stations were abandoned and sold to farms, which allowed the farmers to have more control over their equipment. The final part of the system we're going to look at is the international trade. Who plans and executes it? Well, it's done by the foreign trade monopoly. And the decision-making is basically centralized in a few institutions, and most of the trading is bilateral. What does that mean? This means that the trades were directly negotiated each time with each specific partner. Some Western economists believe that the Soviets were actually deliberately following trade aversion. Also, it's important to note that they were pretty isolated from the world product along with capital markets. All right, that basically sums up the Soviet command economy over the 60-year period before Gorbachev came around. And all my facts and the data I brought up were found in the corresponding chapter in the textbook. And thank you.